Right. Hey, thank you, everybody, so much for joining here. So I wanted to start today this new section for the next, at least the next couple of classes on self-management or self-control. So this is again following that same structure that I'd introduced in previous classes, sort of building on basic mindfulness, building on some self-awareness, and now self-control, self-management, building towards motivation and empathy and leadership as the progression. So the topic of self-control or self-management really is, a lot of it is looking at the practicalities of our actions, our activities, and how to guide our behavior in a way that that's appropriate, brings long-term benefit for ourselves and others, and to begin to sort of certainly at least manage the extremes of our internal reactions, and gradually get better and better ability to control and manage our own internal reactions, resources, thoughts, and so forth. So we can get started as usual just by taking a little bit of time to meditate and settle in. The goal here just to begin to relax and clear our mind so we can listen a bit more readily and deeply. So we can start with this 3-breath practice we've done on a number of occasions in the past. So beginning just by finding a comfortable position. And we can begin just by taking a big breath in and out. Just and then we can breathe in and out, allowing ourselves to relax, with the focus on just relaxing. We can take a breath and ask ourselves, what is important right now? Then we repeat this cycle of 3 breaths, just having a natural breath. Breathing while inviting ourselves to relax. And then breathing, asking ourselves, what is important right now? Then we can repeat this pattern ourselves a couple of times. This pattern of 3 breaths. And then we can open our eyes and relax our focus. So the topic that I wanted to focus on now is self-management. And so the idea of self-management is, in business, they define management as the allocation of scarce resources. So you have a limited amount of time, people, money, whatever else. How are you going to allocate those? So, but when we're talking about self-management, in a sense, it's the same thing. It's we have energy, we have time, we have opportunities. How are we going to spend that, and are we acting in such a way in our own and others' best long-term interests? One of the things that's amazing about our minds is that there's actually, although it doesn't always feel this way, there's actually infinite possibilities for what you could do. For example, after this class, in reality, there's unlimited possibilities. And even in one interaction, what is the next word that we say, right? What's the next thing that we do? In a sense, there's infinite possibilities, but we have a tendency to kind of be a little bit on autopilot and just sort of ideas come, we say things, or we feel like we have limited options. But typically our sense of what our options are is far more limited than what our options actually are. So this expression, thinking outside the box, right? So there's a box that our own mind creates where we sort of feel like we have to do this and we have to do this. We sometimes don't ask why. But whatever we do, in a sense, we've made a decision. So out of those infinite possibilities, when we do take an action, we can only really do one thing at a time. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, but you can't, you can't choose to walk and chew gum and also drive and chew gum at the same time, right? So there's, we make decisions, and those and that is that decision affects our entire future in a sense. Even if it's just a little decision, we chose to take a walk that day as opposed to taking a drive that day. We chose to talk with someone as opposed to ignoring them. That choice of what we do, that choice of how we act, in the space of those endless possibilities, is very much driven by our emotions. So our emotions, so our thoughts govern the sort of cool, calm, collected set of possibilities. What's the theoretical set of possibilities? But our emotions govern which ones seem attractive, which ones seem unattractive, which ones, including scary or unpleasant, which ones feel easy, which ones feel hard. And our emotions, have a fairly limited, the theoretical possibilities that our thinking mind can go through is kind of unlimited. But the range that our emotional mind goes through is some fairly predictable themes, right? It's like, it's like in some, in some forms of cooking, there's a fairly limited set of ingredients, right? You've got, like at home, we eat a lot of Asian food because my wife's Asian. But basically, there's rice, there's some, chilies, and, kimchi, and so forth. But basically, we just recombine that set of options in just a handful of ways. Italian cooking is the same. It's basically it's pasta and bread and something involving tomatoes, and you should basically recombine a finite set of ingredients in different ways. But it's it's limited. So our emotional reactions, the basic one is just pleasant or unpleasant, or neutral, like not particularly pleasant or unpleasant. And then that pleasant, unpleasant, that's basically what our feelings are: good, bad, or neutral. And all of our emotional reactions are variations on that. So see something bad, you get angry, or you have fear. Um, and that's the fight or flight response, as people often talk about. Attractive, you want to have it, or you want to be with it, or you want to become it. These are you see someone who you admire, you want to become like them. You see something that seems attractive, you want to have it. You see, a place or a person that you find pleasant, you want to be with them or be in that space, something like that. It's our emotions that finally guide our actions. So there's the thinking, and there's some feeling about it, and then that's what guides our decisions. And so our decisions are very, very much driven on an emotional level. So just to share a couple of slides on this. So just sharing some of these concepts on self-management. We can define this as the practice of managing our internal states and reactions and resources. And when we talk about internal resources, what are our internal resources? They are especially things like our attention, our time, our energy. This is what we can play with, right? If you're a manager in business, you can allocate money, you can allocate people, you can allocate, rooms and so forth. For us as individuals, what do we allocate? We allocate our time, our attention, and our energy. And our energy always follows our attention. Attention said to be the reins on a horse. This is a traditional analogy that attention is like the reins on a horse, and our intention is like the horse itself. Or you can upgrade that to a steering wheel and a car. But our energy or our intention is like the fuel in the vehicle, but our attention is where we're steering the vehicle. And these things are tightly tied together, time, but you can spend time doing something while not paying attention to it. We do that a lot. But finally, our energy follows our attention. It's what we pay attention to that we give energy to, and our actions and energy and intention are all tightly woven together. So when we talk about managing ourselves, there are our societies went from being a fairly tightly controlled society to being a fairly permissive society. And so I'm talking about the US, over the last 100 years, the way children were raised in the 1800s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, and so forth, was very different from how they started to be raised, in the 60s and 70s, and much more permissive attitude in general, because people started to realize that there were some negative side effects to being too controlling, right? So if you're very controlling, we may fall into some of these patterns like avoiding or repressing or denying our emotional states. And that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about self-management. That's a bit extreme to, for example, try to tightly control your reactions. So you want to make sure that you're not falling into this trap of avoiding negative states of mind, for example, or repressing them or denying them. But what it is learning to act in our own and others' long-term best interest, and learning how to deal skillfully in our interactions with others. There is a concept known as an emotional hijack. And so this book, Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, has lots and lots of stories basically taken from the news of people who experience an emotional hijack, where their emotional reactions cancel out their thought processes, their sort of wise thought processes. And generally, when people are engaging in criminal acts or or killing others and these kinds of things, it's coming out of an emotional hijack. So a lot of the news over the last, there've been a lot of things in the news, right? There's, our own president and his limited ability to control his own emotions, or negligible ability to control his own emotions. But then a lot of the protests that we've seen in the U.S. are because of conflict between poor communities and the police forces that are responsible for trying to maintain law and order, so to speak. So when you find people on both sides of that interaction acting in ways that are impulsive or destructive and so forth, often it's coming from some emotional hijack. So this is it's a politically sensitive topic, right? But someone who kills another person out of fear, right, or steals out of fear, these kinds of things, or engages in sexual activity or sexual misconduct, whatever, out of an uncontrolled desire. In all of these cases, these are where people's emotional centers are overriding their behavior, and they often experience enormous regret afterwards. Hopefully they experience enormous regret afterwards. And so the news is basically full of stories of people who acted just impulsively and irrationally. There was I read a statistic just earlier today that 57% of deaths of children under 12 are caused by their parents or step-parents. And in those cases, it's often just the parents said in retrospect that they just wanted to discipline the child, or they just wanted to, put them under control, or they were just feeling overloaded. Now, under normal circumstances, they would never have acted in violent ways towards their children, hopefully, or they wouldn't have gone out of control. But their emotional center overrode their higher cortex, or the decision-making part of their mind, their prefrontal cortex. So the loop here is that from our eyes, for example, we can see our awareness, visual awareness, is processed by our thalamus, and then this occipital lobe. This is our visual cortex, and it feeds back into these emotional centers, the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hippocampus helps to orient us in our world and figure out, where we are, what's going on, what's the story that's happening right now. But the amygdala is this emotional, like, thermostat. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it scary? In particular, it's very responsive to this. And normally the prefrontal or the frontal lobe here is what's responsible for decision making. But when our amygdala gets triggered, sometimes we call this an amygdala hijack, where you have this very strong emotional reaction and you just feel like you can't control it. And you act in ways that basically, and literally, when the amygdala is stimulated, blood flows to this emotional center and it stops flowing to the frontal lobe. And so literally it's like a switch, these on the old-fashioned, on railways, you can actually move the track switch. So when our emotional center is strongly triggered, literally blood flow reduces to the frontal lobe, and it flows to these emotional centers. And the instinctive or the evolutionary reason for this is because if you're really in a scary situation, you don't need to be thinking about it. You just need to react, right? If someone, jumps out in the dark of night, you don't need to do a whole lot of cognitive processing. There's not a whole lot of thought process. You need to fight or run away. And if you are walking along the ground and you see something that looks like a snake off on the side of the road, you just need to react, right? There's not a whole lot of processing, and your initial response needs to be fast, right? So that's what our emotions are. They're very much prioritized for this fast reaction and intense reaction. Now, what happens though is that um, what we've evolved to do, dealing with things in our physical environment, right, is not is not in general a good match for what we're actually experiencing. And so we can have our mind holding on to ideas of threats, what's a threat, what's good, and so forth, that and we can remember it in ways that are not helpful for us. So we use this, I mentioned this hippocampus is used for sort of orienting ourselves in the world. It's what we use as like a mental map. And so they've been done studies that in the fall, when squirrels are running around storing nuts, their hippocampus actually enlarges, right? Because they're building a mental map of where the nuts are stored. And that there's in London, the taxi drivers used to, maybe they still do, but they used to have to memorize all of the roads in London. And they had to, I think it was called the knowledge. They had to gain the knowledge, which is you had to take a quiz where you could be asked any single road in London and you would know exactly where it was. It's the days of pre-GPS. They found that these London cabbies, they had larger hippocampuses than average people because they had really good mental maps. They had a very strong ability to make a mental map. We make a mental map all the time in our business relationships. What's the org chart look like? What are our customers like? Who are our friends? Who are our enemies? We make all of these mental maps, and we use these mental maps to orient ourselves to the world. So the mental maps that we have of the physical world and the mental maps that we have of our new social world, of our technological world, as a programmer, I spent time as a computer programmer. What programmers are doing when they're figuring out, they're absorbing into the software, and they're building a mental map of, okay, this connects to this, connects to this. So if this is going wrong, it's probably going through here and then going here. And so we build these mental maps, and we use the map forming parts of our mind to orient ourselves even to our virtual world or our social world or our business world. And we do the same thing with our emotional centers. So even the emotional centers in our mind, we use these same primitive emotional centers to deal with our complex world. And so we have to acknowledge the importance of these emotional centers, and we have to recognize how when we are in a situation where we're not just dealing with external threats like a snake on the ground or a person who might jump out at us, we use the same emotional centers to think about our coworkers, right? Who's a threat, who's a friend, right? To our neighbors, our customers, and so forth. And so these same emotional states can be triggered. So if you're in a very difficult meeting, for example, it's easy for our emotional state to get triggered and for us to begin to feel a little bit of anger arising, a little bit of fear arising, and there's actually an emotional reaction. So that puts us, so our emotions are good and necessary, but if the emotional reaction gets too strong, right, you just imagine like it reaches a certain threshold and gets a little bit too powerful, we lose the ability to control it. And that's where self-control and self-management comes into play. The creation of laws in human society. So the early development of human societies were characterized by establishing laws. And those laws generally dictated human physical actions, things like killing. One of the first things that people tend to make laws about: stealing, sexual misconduct, these kinds of things. Society sets some hard limits, and those limits then function, people internalize them. People internalize the story of this is good, this is bad, to begin to set some boundaries on what's appropriate behavior. And when people's emotions get too strong, they may violate those boundaries. They're so desperate for something, they steal. They know they don't think of themselves as a thief, right? But they're so desperate that they steal. And so all of these unethical, what we call unethical behaviors, they all come because of or in almost every case, they come either because people have no sensitivity to the needs of others, they have no empathy, or their emotions get so strong that it overrides their sense of empathy and their sense of good judgment. And we act, we speak, we think as well in ways that are inappropriate, that we just feel like that's not quite right. There's a saying, when you're by yourself, focus on your mind. But when you're with others, focus on your speech. And so speech is very much like thinking. In fact, our thinking is basically we're talking to ourselves. So speech is just a way of sharing thoughts from one person to another. And what happens is that there's kind of a continuum between physical actions and then on one side, and mental thoughts on the other side, but then speech is somewhere in between, right? So there's a lot of things that you can say that are perhaps not illegal, but perhaps unskillful, perhaps coming from like extreme reactions. And so in a work context, it's not likely that we're going to lash out. Hopefully we have enough mental and emotional control that we're not going to lash out and kill someone. And if you're not at that level yet, work hard to get to that level, because you need to move very quickly to get to the level where you're not going to physically act, to kill. Now, people do steal on a work context. There's often these temptations, and we have in society these incredible disproportionate laws where somebody can get imprisoned for shoplifting, but white collar crimes where you're embezzling, $1 billion here and there, sometimes don't lead to prison sentences. They just lead to some soft reprimand. So we find these kinds of unjust systems in the legal practice, but still it's the same motivation. If your greed gets stronger, you're going to try to take a little bit of, you take money or time or resources away from your employer, from your customers, from other people in society, taking things that are not ours. So our ethical tendency, towards stealing gets challenged sometimes. There's challenging situations where we might take things that are not ours to take. In most workplaces, they also have employee education on sexual behavior, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and sexual harassment, these kinds of things, because this is a risk for human beings. This desire becomes so strong that we can't control. We act and speak in ways that cause harm to others. But our verbal behavior, that one is also very, very likely to get us into trouble. So traditionally, we can look at a few kinds of verbal behavior that are problematic. One is lying. Another is hurtful speech. Another is divisive speech. And then another one is just what you'd call meaningless chatter, where you're just endlessly talking and consuming people's time and oxygen, but not bringing any benefit. So lying is one of these things where we're tempted to lie. When I was first applying for a job when I first started shifting into the business world, I had a job application that I had to do, and they gave me an exercise. And to this day, I believe it was actually an ethical challenge, and I failed it. So they said, we have this exercise, we have to give it to you, but it's really not at all important for the job. I want you to write down a list of everybody who you know who's a C-suite or a VP executive. And I was applying for a role as a sales engineer, which is kind of in the sales department. And I can understand why they might ask salespeople, but there's no reason why a sales engineer really matters. At the time, I was not circulating in the high ranks of society. I didn't know a whole lot of C or VP level people. So I was scrounging around through my LinkedIn connections. Oh, I guess this person's CEO of, Andrew Davis Inc. A lot of, and you discover how many people are CEOs of their own one-person corporation. So I listed all of these people, and then there's this one person who accepted my invitation on LinkedIn, who was like the CEO of some big division within Salesforce, which is the organization. And so because they'd accepted my LinkedIn connection request, I listed them as a contact. And then in the interview, the interviewer asked, okay, so who do you know at Salesforce? And so I'm like, well, my cousin works there. That was legitimate. But then, I had listed this other woman who's like the executive director of the Salesforce nonprofit on my list. But he said, okay, do you know anybody else? I'm like, no. And so there was a discrepancy between who I put on that list and who I said verbally that I knew, because verbally I was honest. But he's like, you don't know anybody else at Salesforce? And I'm like, no. But I eventually didn't get the job. But to this day, I believe that he gave me this ethical challenge, right? Because I'd listed somebody on there who I didn't really know, because I was nervous, because I was craving getting this job, craving being seen as important and so forth, that I lied by saying that I had this woman as a connection when I didn't. And so I thought about that so many times afterwards, and the temptation to lie. And there's so many times where there's a temptation to lie, especially in the sales process and marketing and so forth. But that temptation always comes back to bite us, right? Lying always comes back to bite us. But similarly, hurtful speech, where you say things, we all have this amazing power to use our speech as weapons. Like, we can pick any person, and our mind has this amazing, clever power to weaponize our words. We could find something that would really, really hurt. You all could find something to say to me that would just really hurt me. Or even if you don't know each other, you could find something that would really hurt, like somebody you didn't know. And now you're shaking your head because you would never do that. That's great. That's your emotional control, but you could. I promise you. I looked at a recording of myself the other day, and I thought, I sound like Mr. Rogers. So you could say, Andrew, he sounds like Mr. Rogers, and not mean it as a compliment. So it's easy for us to do hurtful speech, right? And in a heated situation, right? I had a situation with one of my bosses in the past where they were just ignoring everything that I was saying and wanting to use their own opinion. And I was just so tempted, so strongly tempted I played it back in my mind. Like, what are all the things that I could say that would really stop that person in their tracks, right? And then you rehearse that after the fact. Like, you think of better and better and better words. And you think, okay, with 5 words, I could stop that person in their tracks. Like, just say, showing off again, eh? or whatever is your chosen words. But that was my boss, right? It's probably not very skillful, for my career development to directly say things intended to hurt their feelings. Now, of course, they need a better ability to absorb that, perhaps, but we know the temptation, the emotional temptation. But there's also an emotional temptation to engage in divisive speech, to make people think poorly of somebody else. If we feel like we're competing with somebody else in the organization, maybe we talk about them behind their back. With somebody, we say, that person, they're so ridiculous, right? We're trying to reduce their reputation. And we're doing it because we feel a craving to be approved of, right? We want to be seen as better than this other person. So we want other people to think lower of this other person and higher of us. And so we maybe do this divisive speech thing where we speak badly about somebody else, or we try to damage somebody else's relationships. And so there's this temptation to use our speech in ways that, are a little bit subtle, but not that subtle at all, actually. It's incredibly obvious when somebody's trying to say something hurtful, and it's incredibly obvious when somebody's trying to say something a bit divisive. And the final action of our speech. I mentioned just meaningless, idle conversation. Sometimes, these days people are very busy. People are always very busy, but we want to make sure that what we're saying and how we're engaging with people is useful for them, and is not just consuming their time and consuming their attention and just basically us expressing things. And so in the spirit of that, I'm going to stop talking now, having conveyed hopefully the essence of this point. And what we can do is a bit of meditation with the last of our precious time together. Thank you so much for giving us this time here. But with the last of our precious time together, we can do a little bit of meditation, just thinking about our speech in particular, and just thinking. We will take a couple of breaths just to meditate on our building a sense of peace. But then we think about our speech and how do we use our speech. And thinking, I want to be very careful if I notice an emotional reaction trying to guide my speech. If my speech is coming from a strong emotional response, making a decision to moderate that, to stop, to notice what's going on, to breathe, and then to respond instead of reacting. So that'll be our meditation. Okay. So we can again just find a comfortable position, maybe adjusting, stretching if it feels good to do so. Again, taking in a deep breath and breathing out. Another breath and just inviting ourselves to relax. And then breathing again and asking ourselves, what is important right now? We can check in with our body and just ask ourselves, how are we feeling? What feelings are arising? And then we can bring to mind a situation where we felt a strong emotional tendency to want to say something that we know is driven mostly by our emotions. Maybe we're in a stressful situation and we're tempted to lie, or we're tempted to say something really hurtful, or we're tempted to try to improve our own reputation at the expense of others, or damage someone else's reputation for our own benefit. Just bring that situation to mind, and we actually try to feel the emotions that we were feeling at that time. What was the emotional reaction that made us so tempted to lash out or lie or damage someone else's reputation, relationship? And just try to bring that situation to mind and try to feel the emotions of that in our body. Just ask ourselves, where do we feel that? Where do we feel that emotion? Try to ground this situation and asking, just noticing, how do we feel when we're strongly tempted to lash out or lie? And we can recall how sometimes that emotion feels so intense that we feel we have no control. But then we can make a decision. I always want to speak in a controlled and wise way. I don't want to let my emotions override my wisdom. Even a little action can have huge negative consequences. We can damage a relationship we've had for decades with just a few words. So we can make a strong determination to never let our speech damage our relationship or be used as a weapon. And just like our body is strong enough to hold back from physically striking out if we're angry. We want a discipline, a determination that's strong enough, that has this deep strength internally to never misuse our speech. Then we can conclude by thinking, even through the short time we've spent together here, we've changed. Our life has taken somewhat different direction. We can think through the power of our reflecting in this way, thinking, learning, our time spent together. What kinds of beneficial results could arise? What kind of harmful situations could we avert just through a brief time focusing on the decision not to misuse our speech? Just reflect on the power of this for a few moments. And then we can open our eyes and arise from our meditation. So that's the end of the formal session here. As we've been doing, if anyone has another 10 minutes or so they want to spend together, we can have some brief pair discussion, but otherwise that's our session for today.